Hello, my name is Dr. John Curry, and I'm going to talk to you again about something from the Archives for the History of Wargaming project. So, last year I published a book on Royal Navy Wargaming 1929 to 1945, and I placed the Watu, the Western Appproaches Tactical Unit, in the context of those wider games. And I'm going to talk to you about the myth versus the reality. So think back to 1942. Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Things were going pretty badly. The shipping losses in 1942 were staggering and just unsustainable. We lost over 1,000 ships in 1942. Winston Churchill said, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." So he was faced by this, and so he instructed Commander Roberts, find out what's happening in the Atlantic, find ways of getting the convoys through and sink the U-boats. So Roberts travelled to Liverpool, and he set up a tactical unit against local opposition in order to evolve anti-U-boat tactics and train escort commanders in the most efficient manner in which to protect the convoys with the small resources available. Now, Roberts wasn't just anybody. He'd actually run wargame fleet actions, gunnery and submarine actions at the Portsmouth Tactical School. So he did know how to run naval wargames. Now, the sources for what he did, we've got unpublished diaries and letters by Captain Roberts. There are some more unpublished notes in my archives. There's a novel which has an account of the game, and there's two key books. And those sources have been used for a series of presentations in recent years. And those presentations have definitely emphasized the role of women in the wargaming. Now, more recently, Chris Carson, independent of my work, looked at this in great detail and analysed some of the Watu tactics. So, the two key books, the Williams book and the more recent Parkin book. Now, Paddy Griffith, who was one of our great tactical historians, in fact, I'm sure he was the one James Dunningham said he was the UK's best tactical historian. It's a shame he never produced two. He looked at the Williams 1979 book, and in the notes in my archive, he said, hang on. He said, what do you mean there's no doctrine for escorts engaging U-boats? Because he was a little bit surprised about this. And he also read the Williams book and took notes on it and said, hang on, there's no sources. So Paddy Griffith was suspicious, and I've kept that in mind all these years till I finally got around to doing further research on this. Who were the staff for Watu? Well, Commander Roberts, a chief yeoman. Now, he'd been at the Portsmouth Tactical School. There were two lieutenant commanders, 4 Wren officers, and 4 Wren ratings. They were the typists. And they trained the Wrens as plotters in signal procedures, organisation, and administration. Yeah, that's what the records say. And there is the Watu tactical unit in its full force, predominantly women. And on front of it, you see the chalk marks on the floor. That's a game in place. And if you see there's a rectangular piece of cardboard with little white ovals on it, that actually represents the position of the convoy. You can see the models on the floor, and the chalk plots are the different courses of the ships and submarines during the game. Now, we actually know quite a lot about the staff who played in the game. Now, but there's been a lot of revisionist history. There's been a new professional wargaming centre set up by the MOD. Defence Experimentation and Wargaming Hub is based at Southwark Park in Hampshire. And they named some of the rooms after the Wrens. And they did this because they said they were the outstanding professional wargamers of World War II. In fact, if you go to the Defence Experimentation Hub, you can see it. Actually, there were lots of other wargamers in World War II. I could mention Montgomery, Rommel, the Royal Navy, the RAF, the United States Navy. In fact, I published a book on war games from World War II with a sample of the different types of games which were being played. Now, the Parkin book had the story of the Royal Navy Escort Training Unit, all about Watu, and it highlights the Wrens played a critical part. And this has been, well, I'll give you a quote. "This is the riveting true story of war, amazing women, and one of the most important games in history. A group of unlikely heroes, retired naval captain, and a clutch of brilliant young women." And the book has a string of anecdotes from the Wrens and their families that added a human factor to the tale very nicely. And the Western Approaches Tactical Museum in Liverpool, great, well worth going to see it, by the way, has many displays about the Wrens who worked there, their biographies and photos of them. But the Watu Museum doesn't actually tell us much about the game. So, I have issues as an academic wargaming historian with the book. First of all, it said that the school was secret, but actually during war, what training school was not secret? The claim that Watu won the war is just outrageous. I mean, that is... Now, Watu was an important part of a bigger jigsaw. You know, I mean, shipbuilding was critical to the U-boat war, anti-submarine warfare development, code-breaking, etc. Watu was just a part of it. Now, the assertion in the book that Britain was weeks away from starving and Watu reversed that trend, well, scholarship has shown there were many shortages. The diet in wartime Britain was boring, but people were not starving. There were various errors in the book, like Hedgehog had 20 bombs, actually had 24. All U-boat transmissions began with a B bar, actually only convoy contact reports did. Or it says things like the Wrens being responsible for decoding at Bletchley Park. Now that is just nonsense. They were a part of the code breaking effort, but to say they were responsible for the code breaking is sort of ignoring all those listening stations which were recording the German radio traffic, or all those mathematicians working on it, the drivers who were taking the transcripts of the messages as they were written down and getting them to Bletchley Park as fast as possible. The organisation, it's just, yeah. So to say the Wrens were responsible, it's a little bit of rewriting history. So let's go back a step. Interwar wargaming and the Royal Navy. Between World War I and World War II, the tactical school at Portsmouth was tasked with teaching and developing tactics, and they did. They had people teaching guns, torpedoes, navigation, signals, air and submarines. And in 1935, the tactical course consisted of lectures, military problems, and tactical games, and largely they were concerned with the British battle fleet versus the Japanese battle fleet, because that was seen as the main threat. And they had lectures on technical details, historical confrontations, where they talked through an action such as Jutland. And the problems were staff college exercises, so you set out a situation, and the students then go away, consider the problem, and submit a written, reasoned course of action. And these are marked, and then the directing staff, the DS, give the staff a solution with the implication the staff solution is the correct one. So, for example, you might say you've got 3 cruisers and 5 destroyers, you're covering amphibious landing. This is your potential opposition. What you do as a screening force. They were also playing various war games, and they played these using the Royal Navy 1929 or 21 and 29 rules. Now, submarines were just a minor part of this confrontation, as no one saw the Battle of the Atlantic with merchant convoys under attack by air, surface raiders, or submarines. Well, okay, that's not actually true. The problem with scholarship, it just ruins a good historical narrative. So Dennis Wheatley, for example, published a game called Blockade. Now, it was a hobby game, but it was a serious attempt at looking at convoys, merchant ships, air attacks, naval attacks, surface raiders. I've just included a screenshot of some of one of the combat tables. So that's quite clear he did anticipate that. And he didn't think it on his own. It's clearly people were considering these problems prior to World War II. So in 1935, there were 3 tactical schools of thought. One was the Royal Navy should continue to use battle line tactics as the basis for tactical thought. And basically, the way you beat the enemy is you get your heavy ships to pound the enemy ships with gunnery. The second radical thought was battle fleets were obsolete, and all that was required was aircraft carriers and destroyers. And they played some games about this. I've included one of them in my book. Or another school of thought was Jutland should no longer be studied. By fleet actions based on carriers, asymmetrical forces such as what happens if a battleship encounters destroyers, inshore operations, night fighting, shadowing. And these games actually produced a whole variety of useful tactics. So, for example, Captain Roberts, who was part of it, produced guidance on how 3 light cruisers could fight a pocket battleship. And that was really convenient because in 1935, at the Battle of the River Plate, that's exactly what happened when 3 British cruisers had to engage a pocket battleship, the Graf Spee. Another example was how to attack a battle cruiser by a flotilla of destroyers, the star attack method. And that is actually what they used when they were fighting against the Scharnhorst. So they were producing good stuff. So the Western Approaches Tactical School, 1942 to 1945. So he was appointed to evolve anti-U-boat tactics, find the ways, getting the convoys through and sink the U-boats. So what did he use? Well, almost certainly he would have used the 1929 Royal Navy rules. Why would he have done this? Because he knew how to use them. He had no time. It was wartime. You do not have time to write a new set of rules. And that's why we haven't found a complete set of the Watu rules. So I've got a set of the combat tables, which I've included in my book, because they were just building on the 1929 Royal Navy game. Why wouldn't you? Why would you invent something new? Now, Watu, Liverpool, it was the lone centre of excellence against the U-boats. Well, apart from the 2 schools in Northern Ireland and the other ones, such as India, Africa, and Canada. Now, they were all tactical units, and they were all playing war games. Now, I assume that each centre focused on games that were most relevant to their theatre of operations, but I don't actually know because the scholarship has not yet been done. But Watu was not alone. Lots of people were looking at exactly the same problems, especially in Canada. So the Western Approaches game, well, the playing area was the floor. The scale was 10 inches to 1 nautical mile. So the floor represented 20 miles by 20 miles. And each turn was 2 minutes. But they used the variable bound length turn, which if appropriate, the controller can increase the length of time being covered by each move. So if there was a lull in the action, for example, you don't need to keep trickling along at 2-minute intervals. So you could say, oh, let's do 10, 20 minutes. And the U-boats moved 1/3 of an inch per knot of speed. So if the U-boat was sailing at 12 knots, it would move 4 inches on the floor. Now, there's a game actually in progress. Obviously, that's a stage photograph with everyone staring at it. So what are they doing? They're clearly looking at signals. The Wrens are plotting the movement of the ships, which involves protractor to get the angle. You calculate the speed, turn that into inches, and that's how far they go. And you mark out the movement in chalk on the floor, which is useful for the after-action reviews. Now, the models were somewhat crude, okay? There's an example of one on the right-hand side. So Captain Roberts gave them a model each to take home with them at the end of the war. And they used to have a little flag on it, P for corvette, L for frigate, U for U-boat. Now, the U-boat models weren't used until the post-game debrief. So the U-boat's positions on the floor were just marked. I think it was in brown chalk, which was very difficult to see from a distance because obviously no one could see the U-boats. And what happens is the tactical players were the captain of the ship. They perhaps, theoretically, they had a second command and navigated plot position. And they had a limited view of the views using a view screen. There we are. So you see this is in a test game. There's a board, there's a canvas, a little hole in it, and it doesn't actually show you just the area of your ship. It shows the general area the battle's being fought in, but it makes it a little bit more, I don't know, engaging and lifelike. Paddy Griffith called this a cardboard simulator, basically, where you limit the view of the battlefield. Now, there's a test game in progress. Now, a couple of the Wrens on the right-hand side sat at the table. There isn't room for 3 people, but it almost looks like each ship is commanded by one person sat at a table because there isn't a second chair. There we've got the screen looking through, and they're checking to see what they can see. The Wrens take the orders to the plot table just there. The plot table then gives them to the Wrens, and the Wrens move each ship, as in they've got the angle to move it at the speed they're doing. And then Captain Roberts and one of the commanders then arbitrates the gunnery and the actions, etc. Sat next to him was one of the Wrens, and she commanded the U-boats during the operations on the floor, and she did most of the games, apparently. Now, of course, you've got to remember, though, that it was not an interactive game, insomuch as the U-boats almost certainly had pre-plotted attacks and plans prior to the game, because if you could allow her looking at the floor to keep changing her position, change the orders in the light of what she's seen, she'd be able to see far more than an actual U-boat would be able to see bobbing up and down in the Atlantic. So her job was just to follow the plan. So they sat at the table, and the officer commanding the ship produced the move sheet, and there's on the right-hand side. And you say your unit, the time, the course, the speed, what your radar's doing, what the ASDIC is doing, what your intentions are, and anything else. And it said the moves were posted in a letter box beneath their table, but I can't see that in any of the photographs. Why would you? Wouldn't you just write it and just hand it to the Wren who'd pick it up? And the night games were interesting because actually the players could largely see nothing. All the information was passed by signal, ASDIC, or radar. So it means people writing out reports back to them saying, what's your ASDIC detected? What's your radar detected? Now, as radio transmissions are sent, what happens is the Wrens copy them very quickly, and they run around to distribute them to the other escort commanders. So there's an example of play, and this is from the Williams book. It says the time, and then you give the mover, points to it, that's you, tells them what they can see, anything they can hear, and instantly the mover in this one gives an example suggesting the player shouldn't clutter the radio transmission air at the moment. Yeah, so that's what the game was like. What was the impact of the games? Well, they trained about 3,500 people went through it. That's by December 1944. And they trained games for convoy commanders and escort captains. They also were running analysis games to help develop understanding and evolve new tactics and try new ideas. And the training games had an obvious advantage. You basically give lectures and they'd run through common tactical situations in an engaging and realistic manner to maximize the learning. Experiential learning. You know, anyone in education now would understand the value of that. So the playing pieces, there we are. So you can see the convoy is represented by that long rectangular black piece of card. Each of the white ovals on it represents a ship because the merchant ships basically need to stay in formation. If they don't or they're destroyed, they simply put a chalk X through them. You can see the playing pieces. There's a little U-boat there. There's a destroyer. There's merchant ships. The 4 little ovals in the center, that's shell splashes. And there's cotton wool on the left-hand side. That's obviously smoke. Probably lamb's wool. Okay. Now, Roberts said he invented the raspberry maneuver. Well, and we all believe that. Well, actually, when you look at it, it's actually the Royal Navy artichoke or the American zombie. And it was a standard maneuver used to counter attacks against submerged submarines on a convoy during daylight. And Chris Carson has gone through this in detail and has challenged Roberts' claims to innovation extensively. And it's interesting, he did his work independent of mine, and we both came to the same conclusions. So there's an example of the syllabus. Now, the syllabus changed throughout the war. So when the convoys were going to northern Russia, for example, the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday games included air and U-boat attack, but also surface actions, in particular the threat of the Scharnhorst, until it was sunk, of course. And during the preparations for D-Day, the course was on finding U-boats which were hiding on the sea floor, rather than U-boats which were moving. So they did dynamically change what the game was doing. Another issue is that Watu was not one game, it was three. I don't know why people say it was one game. The first game was for operation analysis. So what he used to do is go out and talk to convoy commanders, get their after action reports, and reenact those battles actually on the floor. And they tried to work out where were the attacking U-boats, where could they have been, and try and work out the best tactics to maximize the chance of catching an attack on a U-boat. The second type of game was training, and this is the game which we all talk about, and that was teaching escort commanders, not all of whom English was the first language, to apply these tactics. And the third type of game, well, they did run a strategic game. So they had a map game which was mimicking the actual Battle of the Atlantic, and it was basically to establish whether if you took escort ships out away from the convoys and made them into naval support groups, and they then rushed from convoy under attack to convoy under attack, would it actually work? And the game said, yes, if you did this using the real map, the live situation, and we had these fantasy support groups, they would actually get to the battle in time. Now, we only have evidence of one such game, but the Watu game was three. So it was operation analysis, the second was training, and the third was a strategic game. So there's the Western Approaches plot room. It's up in Liverpool. Great museum to see it. There you have it. There's your plot board. And there you have your sliding ladder where you plot the position of the ships. Sadly, one of the wrens fell off during the war and died as a result of the flaw. And this was updated 24 hours a day, depending on what was actually happening. Was Captain Roberts' CBE recognised sufficiently for his contribution? He clearly didn't think he was. But he did get a CBE, and he also got awards from Norway, Poland, and France. And there weren't a huge number of British officers during World War II, which actually got awards from Britain, Norway, Poland, and France. But of course, the highest accolade was from the Director of Tactical Torpedo and Staff Duties Division, 1945. And he said the Western Approaches Tactical Unit was commended for its work some time ago. In fact, the director was decorated, but the high value of the school and high standard maintained is considered to have justified a letter to say that the work of the school has not passed unnoticed. And in the British language at the time, saying, your work has not passed unnoticed, I mean, that was the British way of saying you're brilliant. Roberts was also asked post-war, after he retired, to give talks to the Royal Navy on the convoy war and tactics in future wars, and to be called back after the war to speak to current professionals about the future of armed conflict. Well, that's another sign of recognition and respect. So what are the conclusions based on the evidence? The Watu game was based on the 1929 Royal Navy game with updates to the tables, and those tables, gunnery tables and torpedo hit tables, that should be updated throughout the war. It wasn't just in Liverpool, it was run in 7 other tactical schools. The role of the Wrens has been overemphasized. What was their duty in the game? Their duties were administration, typing. When the games were being run, they collected the signals, put them to the central table, where Captain Roberts would then arbitrate. The Wrens on the floor would have to use a protractor and ruler and move little ship models around the floor. And one of them was in charge of the U-boat operations, following a pre-prepared plan. Were the games useful? Well, over 90% of the escort commanders had previously no formal anti-submarine warfare training, so actually the course was really useful. All the tactical units, around the British Empire were clearly important, part of the training cycle. So, conclusions based on the evidence. The Admiralty clearly thought the Watu game was a training game. There isn't actually evidence of successful tactical innovation. So Robert's claim of tactical brilliance seems to have been overstated. Robert and his Wrens were expert at running anti-submarine war games. They were not experts in running anti-submarine warfare. There is a difference between commanding basically a toy ship on the floor and actually doing it for real in the Battle for the Atlantic. But the game was for wider training than just the operations of the Battle of the Atlantic. Convoys around the world, training for D-Day actions, actions against surface raiders, actions against air attack. The games were far more than just submarines. They had strategic games about carrier support groups, and these were important inputs in decision-making to use them. There's also the Walker-Roberts feud. Well, doesn't seem to exist in any of the biographies of Walker. So did that ever happen? Don't know. Was Captain Roberts recognised? Well, I think I presented the evidence that he clearly was recognised by different countries and, more important, by his peers. So, women's contribution to wargaming. Well, actually, if we want to look at the time, perhaps we should look at the Fletcher Pratt naval wargame. This was a hobby game run in America, primarily in New York, but not just in New York, 1932 to 1945. And it had people such as Asimov, Sprague to Camp, etc. playing the game along with Fletcher Pratt. And there we have actual evidence of women in charge and running the games. We got photographs, we've got sketches. And for example, Inga Pratt, which was Fletcher Pratt's wife, when he was away in the war, he was a war reporter on ships in the Pacific, she ran a 120 player game, which included the US Admiral for the South Atlantic and his staff. No pressure there then. And interestingly enough, the opposing team was actually being run by women. Maybe we should talk about the Fletcher Pratt naval war game and Inga Pratt if we want examples of naval wargamers from the period. So I hope you found that was interesting, and I tried to tackle some of the myth versus reality. And if you want to know more, you can look at the book I co-authored. Well, I hope you found that talk was interesting.